Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Scala webinar. My name is Margarita Mooney Suarez. I am the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation. I'm pleased to have with us today Fran Maier, who will be speaking to us about the vast work from Roger Scruton, and we gave it the provocative title, Idle Hands, Distracted Minds, Roger Scruton and the Attempt to Save Culture from Meaninglessness. Before we dive into this topic, I know we have a lot of first-time viewers of one of Scala's webinars that are joining us today. So I just wanted to share with people Scala's mission to renew American culture by restoring meaning and purpose in universities, in schools, and promoting a classical liberal arts education with a keen attention to educating for wisdom and beauty. Scala aims to empower leaders to renew our culture by introducing them to the virtues of truth, beauty, and goodness expressed in art, poetry, literature, philosophy, theology, and history. Today's topic, the work of Roger Scruton, is extremely important to Scala's mission because every young person faces existential questions. What does it mean to be human? What's my purpose in life? What is the meaning of freedom? And ultimately, I think Roger Scruton's tremendous legacy of work can help students answer these fundamental questions about identity, freedom, and the common good. Scala believes that classical liberal arts helps young people know how to use their freedom and help them develop a love for learning while forming strong communities, friendships, and shared experiences of beauty. So we aim to help people, students, educators, cultural entrepreneurs, live lives full of meaning and purpose and help them to flourish in ways that benefit others based on this idea that we're created in the image and likeness of God. These webinars are one of the ways that we accomplish our mission. This is the 5th webinar in our series, Educating for Beauty and Wisdom. You can find all of the webinars from this series on Scala's YouTube channel, and you can find our webinars from our first webinar series that led to a book, The Love of Learning, also on Scala's YouTube channel. These videos will be transcribed, they'll become published, and will become an educational resource for people who want to spread these ideas in churches, schools, homeschoolers, universities, or reading groups. So please, if you haven't already, be sure you read our newsletters and find out about more resources. Today, I would like to thank especially the sponsor of this webinar, the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where my good friends, George Harn, James Matthew Wilson, and many others are working to rebuild American culture by promoting the fine arts and integrating the arts with their strong programs in business and medicine. So look out for the amazing work being done by the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and thank you for partnering with us on this webinar today. Now, to introduce my dialogue partner, my friend, Fran Meyer. I'm not exactly sure who introduced me to Fran, but he's actually my neighbor. He lives about 30 minutes from me in Princeton. He lives in Pennsylvania, and we meet regularly for lunch. And we have such fascinating conversations that I thought, you know, Fran, every time we talk, I feel like the two of us could write a book together. So why don't we start and just do a dialogue on a thinker that we both love, Roger Scruton. But let me tell you a little bit about Fran. I didn't actually know this until I started to plan for this webinar, that Fran's initial career was supposed to be in film. So Fran studied filmmaking and storytelling, and then ended up for about 47 years, or roughly my entire lifetime, working in the Catholic Church. He has been a special assistant to Archbishop Chaput, first in Denver and then in Philadelphia. Fran has also been a prolific writer. You can find his writings on The Catholic Thing, where he publishes regularly. And thank you, Fran, for writing about my book, The Love of Learning and The Catholic Thing.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
And Fran also writes regularly for First Things blog. So I will, and Fran is also a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., as well as the University of Notre Dame. He's a co-founding board member of the University of Pennsylvania's Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought, a wonderful institution. And he's a board member of the Napa Institute, which I attended for the first time last year. So Fran, to get us started, I just wondered, I've talked with you so many times, and it wasn't until this week that I realized you set out to study film. So can you tell us how your interest in film somehow led you to work for Archbishop Chaput and study the work of Roger Scruton?
Well, pardon me. It's a long story, and I'll give you the short version. I mean, I always had an interest at Notre Dame, and then at New York University, and then at the American Film Institute in storytelling. And in my lifetime, film became really one of the main delivery systems for really good stories. It affected me in a big way. I remember Ingmar Bergman and a whole bunch of other Antonioni and people like that really affected the way that I thought, and I wanted to pursue that. So I had a fellowship to the American Film Institute, and that led directly into working as a story analyst and a screenwriter in Hollywood, which I did for about 6 years. We made a living at it, but it wasn't very satisfying in the sense that it's just not an environment that's friendly to any kind of stability and family and marriage. And I just stumbled into a part-time job actually with the National Catholic Register. 3 months later was the editor-in-chief, and I did that for 15 years. And it just, the church is always interested, religion has always interested me because it has profound answers to the questions that everybody has in terms of, why am I here? What am I doing? What does my life mean? For me, the Catholic Church answered those things in a really profoundly satisfying way. And so it was easy for me to make the transition into then working in diocesan service for about 27 years, 23 of them for Archbishop Chaput. And that led me to my contact with Scruton, actually, because Chaput had a really deep interest in popular culture. He saw it as a very effective catechetical machine, and understanding popular culture and its effect on people was very important to him. So one of my jobs was research, and that brought me into contact with the work of Scruton. And, Scruton makes a big point about how religion is really the root of every culture, not necessarily a specific denomination, but religion is critical to the development of culture. Yeah. And so that's where I ended up.
Well, hey, I did not know that about you, Fran, but you might be interested to know that this morning, as part of Scala's efforts to work with young culture creators, we have a writers group in Princeton, and one of them is a screenplay writer and has worked in movie scripts and was in Hollywood. And he went from Hollywood to study theology with the Dominicans because he—
Sensible man.
But so there aren't that many people with a film background and a theology background. That's why I mentioned it. Caleb Brown is his name. And of course, Bill Gonch, who works with Scala, is leading up our writers program. So you'll hear more from us about that. But you discovered this philosopher, Roger Scruton, because he helped you in some ways link together what you were already doing, thinking about the relationship between popular culture and the Catholic faith. Well, I discovered Roger Scruton, honestly, only about a year before he passed away. He passed away about a year or two ago. And I almost say that as a sad point, because I have already been in sociology and teaching practical theology now. I mean, I've been an academic for most of my adult life. And somehow, in all the classes that I ever taught, no one ever assigned Roger Scruton. But when I encountered him, and let me tell readers how I encountered him, similar to you, I was looking for somebody who could understand the power of beauty and culture to communicate the truth and the good. And I had been trained in sociology, where, as Alasdair MacIntyre has pointed out, most of the framings of the good are some kind of functional or instrumental, right? Mm-hmm. You get something for yourself, you give something to get something. And Roger Scruton comes from, I'd say, a different philosophical tradition that's not based on utilitarianist calculations or functional calculations, but a kind of philosophy of the person where the unfinished nature of being human, the relationality, and our desire for transcendent goods is fundamental to who we are. And I discovered Roger Scruton in particular because he expresses these ideas that I just said in a powerful way. So for readers and listeners, I hope we're going to unpack some of these ideas. But it would be impossible to cover all of his life. Again, preparing for this webinar, I read about his life and I read about what he published, and wow, is it broad. But why don't we start with a piece that I know has interested you and I think ties into where you've come now through your 47 or so years of work in the church. What are the reasons for pessimism and what are the reasons for optimism about modern culture and how it impacts the church and people of faith and people who care about the common good? What can Roger Scruton help us understand about pessimism and optimism about culture today?
Well, I think, this will lead inevitably into his book, The Uses of Pessimism, which I love the title. It's just, he talks about in that book 7 basic fallacies of the modern era. I mean, the best case fallacy, the utopian fallacy, the aggregation fallacy, and he breaks those off and explains them in great detail. But his point is that we're living in a period after religion when we have to have substitutes, and these delusions of false hope really are a constant addiction to people. And his attitude was that unscrupulous optimism, which he uses that phrase to describe these different fallacies that are so dominant in modern culture, need a little bit of pessimism. And pessimism is a good medicinal antibody to kind of delusional thinking. The next 5-year plan is going to fix everything, is one example of the utopian or the planning fallacy that he talks about. So pessimism is actually something that people don't want to hear about because they automatically assume it's negative. But a little bit of it, which really translates into a sensible realism, is something that we all need to cultivate. You can be hopeful and pessimistic at the same time. And a perfect example of that, not the only one, but certainly the greatest, is Augustine. Augustine lived in a time of complete turmoil, collapse of civilization, and yet he was a hopeful man. But he didn't delude himself into thinking that tomorrow was necessarily going to be better than today, because circumstances of reality on the ground dictated against that. So I think that approach to optimism and pessimism on Scruton's part was one of the things that appealed to me. There is just a common sense wisdom to his thinking that's very accessible to ordinary intelligent people. His writing has the same quality in a sense as Neil Postman's, in taking very big ideas and translating them into language that's accessible to reasonably intelligent people, but not necessarily intellectuals or academics.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned that. So Scruton's reasons for pessimism stem from his concern that we've really lived through a period of desacralization of culture. Now, for those of you who haven't read Roger Scruton or don't know his biography, he's from England. He studied in Paris as well as in England, and he spent most of his academic career writing in England, which, of course, England and France have become more desacralized and have fewer adherents to formal religion than in the United States. And you spoke about how he was concerned that the substitutes for religion that have been proposed just give delusions of false hope. What I found so interesting in preparing for this webinar was reading that Scruton himself as a student lived through the 1968 student protests.
That was
now, a lot of people listening, what was 1968, who knows, but why were the 1968 student protests so influential in his thinking? And he writes about this, by the way, in his article from around 2003 about why he calls himself a conservative. So what did the student revolts of 1968 do to Roger Scruton's thinking? And dare I ask, is there a parallel between what Scruton observed in 1968 and what we've observed in the United States in the last few years?
Yes, I think, well, Scruton was a man of the left originally, and I believe he was a grad student in Paris during the 1968 riots. And it became very clear to him that the riots were being conducted by well-educated, well-fed bourgeois kids who were raging against a system on which they depended. And the kind of disconnect intellectually between action and reality was formative for him. I mean, he saw the whole thing as an exercise in delusional hypocrisy, and that changed his politics. And then, of course, he became very involved later in his career in the East Bloc, where he took Marxism and Leninism and observed its actual practice on the ground and the kind of oppressive reality that flowed from, kind of a utopian idea of the future. So that European experience, first in Paris, which really was a conversion point for him, and then later in his experience of intellectuals in England, and then the lived reality in Czechoslovakia and places like that in the East Bloc, those things all shaped him in a certain way that made him a scrupulous pessimist in terms of politics.
Yeah. Well, his biography, although I lived, I'm younger than Scruton was, his biography, that story resonated a lot with me. He recounts these experiences in multiple places, but one place for readers to look is his article, Why I'm a Conservative. And he talks about watching the student protests in 1968. And as you mentioned, later on in his life, comparing that to what he saw in Czechoslovakia behind the Iron Curtain under communism. And I think what he was concerned about was that the revolutionary fervor, the protests behind the students, was teaching people to search in the world for things to hate. And he worried about culture becoming fundamentally about anger and resentment. And he thought, from what I can see in his articles and his books that we're going to talk about, he thought that actually academic ideas being promoted in the humanities in Europe were fundamentally grounded in a philosophy of the human person that couldn't get us out of a cycle of conflict, anger, hate, and resentment. So he started to look back, or look to a different philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, Augustine, Christianity, to try to construct a vision of the person and a vision of culture that's ultimately positive, not destructive. So he narrates in Why I'm a Conservative his encounter with Burkean conservatism, that society, in order to have any kind of common good, has to have some sense of tradition, custom, establishment, settled communal ways. And he discovered a defense of obedience and authority properly understood, which I want us to get to. Right. But he basically says that modern politics has become cultural and ecological vandalism. Mm-hmm. So that resonated with me, because as a graduate student in sociology, I had already traveled multiple times to Cuba, where my mother was born and raised. I had spent weekends weeks actually, with former combatants of civil wars. And so I had seen the destruction left behind by the Cold War and by revolutionary movements. And I was struggling to see where I fit, someone who cares about the common good, someone who cares about justice, but I couldn't embrace a violent revolutionary spirit. And that's what fascinates me, that then Scruton decides to become a conservative and a philosopher who writes about aesthetics. Mm-hmm.
Well, I was going to say that what you're describing is one of the most interesting things about him, which is here you have this very highly educated intellectual who has a skepticism about abstract ideas. Abstract ideas are beautiful in the sense that they're very pure. But precisely because they're pure, they're disconnected from reality. I mean, human beings are not pure. They're organic and they're messy, and reality is a mess. I think what attracted him about Burkean philosophy, Burkean politics, was Burke's emphasis on little platoons, modest size reality that people could actually live in. And abstractions, people can't live in abstractions. And when we fashion a world out of abstractions, it becomes anti-human. And he saw that again and again, first in France, then in the Eastern Bloc. He saw it in his own university environment. He had a genius for being connected to the earth, and he cultivated that in his own life. I mean, he was a farmer, he raised horses, he very systematically lived in the world and not simply in his head. And that profoundly shaped the way that he wrote, which was just incredibly human and appealing, I think.
Well, I think to get back to the point you made about him, right, that his experience as a student in Paris and as an intellectual in his time in Czechoslovakia all pointed to the same idea that utopian ideals had failed, right? Mm-hmm. So in the Uses of Pessimism, he's kind of saying, look, this kind of abstract optimism has led to utopianism, which has led to social projects that have in some ways had the opposite consequence of what they set out to do. So in his essay, The Uses of Pessimism, he, I think, elaborates more on this point, as you said, in his attempt to communicate to everybody using common sense language what they need to know about culture. So another one of his books that you brought to my attention is The Intelligent Person's Guide to Modern Culture. And by intelligent, I don't think he means having a Cambridge PhD or being an Oxford Don or a Harvard professor. By intelligent, he means, I think, wisdom. Mm-hmm. People who see reality as it is. And I say that because I just want to mention to our listeners that although he published, I couldn't even count how many books were on his bibliography, maybe 50 books, not to mention his essays and his fantastic lectures, he was never well received in the academy, especially not in his home country of England. So his writings were not intended to be read only by their academics. They were intended to be read by anybody. And his lectures are phenomenal. So tell us a little bit about this Intelligent Person's Guide to Modern Culture, because that's what gave rise to the title of this webinar, Idle Hands and the Devil's Work. What on earth is Scruton getting at in that book?
Well, yeah, if you read the two in tandem, as you should, they're I think the second and third last essays of his book. He focuses primarily on Foucault and Derrida, and therefore he focuses on the culture, what he called the culture of repudiation with Foucault, and deconstruction with Derrida. And the conclusion, of course, the two essays together are built on that old proverb, idle hands are the devil's workshop. And the point that he's making with both of those thinkers is that intellectual prowess in the last 50 years has largely been identified with the ability to deconstruct and see through the illusions of, for example, religion and tradition. And what that does finally is enhance the apparent power of intellectuals, but at the same time completely evacuate culture of any meaning. So that what you end up with at the end is sort of a idolatry of nothingness. He uses that expression, particularly in The Devil's Workshop. So he had a very sharp criticism of intellectuals as a class because they really excel at deconstructing things and taking away from culture any kind of a meaning that average people can live with. They can live in a rarefied air of nothingness, but really very few other people can. People need meaning. And he saw Foucault and Derrida and their followers as primarily robbers, thieves of the meaning that needs to sustain common culture.
Look, some of our listeners might never have themselves encountered Foucault and Derrida. In fact, if you haven't sat through a humanities seminar in the United States, sorry, you probably haven't. So you might be asking yourself, why do I need to know who Foucault and Derrida are if I'm not going to get a humanities degree? And I think what Scruton is saying and what you've just said is that if you want to understand how it is that ideas being promoted in the humanities have fundamentally taken the idea of culture as being connected to something sacred, as something beautiful, and turned that into culture is nothing but the promulgation of meaninglessness, and therefore social relations are nothing but power, then you need to understand these ideas. And what he does, I'll say the first book I ever read by Scruton was given to me by a friend in Vienna. And it was only like 3 years ago, as I said, a year before Scruton died. And I had this book on the long flight with me home from Vienna, and I couldn't stop laughing. It was Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Great book. And again, it's even a better book if you've sat through seminars of Foucault and Derrida and wondered what the heck is happening here and what does any of this mean. I was so excited reading that book that I wanted to wake up the stranger next to me so I could explain it to him. Because what got Scruton in trouble was his witty way of almost making fun of some of the theories that are being promulgated here, but making fun of them in a way that makes this point really strongly, that the exalted student leaders of 1968 were really nihilists who were promoting meaninglessness. And behind their destruction, there wasn't really a constructive project. Their project is deconstruction. And Scruton was really bothered by this because the ethical life has to be upheld by a shared culture, right? How do we have a common culture if all we can do is deconstruct? And if the task of the intellectual, a la Foucault, who we mentioned, right? If the task of the intellectual for Foucault is nothing but unmasking power,
right,
then the claim is that the fundamental basis of all reality and all social relations is power. And that fundamental assertion of nothingness means that all power, that there's no such thing as legitimate authority, all forms of authority are domination. And if all forms of authority are domination, how on earth do we ever have a common life? And I think these theorists, he even says, go as far as to say that even what you think of is love and friendship is actually a form of domination. And in my field of sociology, shockingly, we don't write about love and friendship. We might write about how people think about love and friendship, but we never write about love and friendship as ultimately human goods that we all desire. So I think what he's trying to get us to is in this work, idle hands, is that intellectuals have come to define themselves as having a role of unmasking power and deconstructing culture. And where does that leave us? Is that a fair assessment of his concern, his critique?
Oh, I think it is. But there's one thing that it took me a while to notice myself, and it appears in one of his other essays. That process of unmasking and deconstructing also establishes the intelligentsia as a power class. They're the ones with the power to interpret and deconstruct and unmask. So it's a transfer of power from the traditional sources in culture to the intelligentsia. And I think that's one of the reasons why Scruton, as an intellectual, had such a skeptical, and you put your finger exactly on the real crime that he committed was having a sense of humor and making fun of intellectuals. They don't like it at all. And he was very good at it. And but the heart of the matter is that every culture needs a priestly class. And in Judaism, it's the rabbinate. In Christianity, it's the priesthood or the ministerial vocation. In secular culture, it becomes experts, intellectuals, and he wants to at least name that so people understand what's happening to them, because experts and intellectuals are very good at hiding behind words that mask what they're doing.
Yeah, so I think what you've just said, he does spell it out in that essay, but he goes into more detail about it. That ironically, what's ended up happening is that this project to unmask and to critique ends up elevating intellectuals as having the most important kind of power, which is that of unmasking and that of critiquing. But then he says it's a nihilistic project because, as you said earlier, human beings intrinsically desire meaning and purpose. And so what I think his critique is that the common project in the humanities used to be, right, preserving the common good, preserving a shared culture, passing on a legacy, and educating people to create the new common culture that binds us. And what happens when the people who hold humanities positions, now, I don't want to generalize, it's not all of them. There's certainly exceptions to this. Every English department and art history department and so on has exceptions to this. But if you've ever spent time in a humanities classroom in England, which I have, or in France, which I have, or in the United States, which I have, you know that he's right, that it's fundamentally a deconstructive project. And when you try to bring back meaning and purpose as having objective reality, wow, do people throw up barriers. But his point is, if you look at classical philosophy, if you look at any world religion, guess what? Human beings intrinsically desire meaning and purpose. And intellectuals are giving themselves the power to deconstruct that. No wonder that leads to the things I see among students: burnout, nihilism, the suicide epidemic. Now, there's multiple causes of that, but to say that what they're being taught isn't one of the causes for why they conclude that there's no meaning to their own life would seem to me to be naive, right? So, I mean, to use Scruton's own words, we have left students with, quote, a world devoid of sacred and sacrificial moments. And we don't give students a vision that there's a reason to preserve culture, socially reproduce. We just give a destructive role. And so, as you say, the intelligentsia has become itself a power class, a priestly class proclaiming meaninglessness. Is that a fair?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And if you look at that priestly class response to Scruton's death, if you read the obituary, for example, in The Guardian or the New York Times, there's a very thinly veiled repugnance for him and a resentment for what he did. They don't forgive very easily. And that's really very obvious in the way that they treated his obituaries. I found him, as I've said before, I mean, what I love about Scruton is that he took, here, I'll put it this way. One of the things that got me on the path of my career was reading Richard Weaver and, ideas have consequences. Ideas have practical consequences. And what Scruton did is he took the ideas motivating popular culture and high culture, for that matter, in the modern era, and just did a deconstruction on them, explain what was happening and why we were getting the results that we did. And that just would automatically appeal to me in him, that he gave an explanation about why we're at the place we're at. And he did it with a great sense of humor. One of his essays was called Euthanasia, which is kind of a deconstruction of modern youth culture. It's really very funny, and he had that ability to mix deep thought, great traditional wisdom, and this kind of ironic British sense of humor in a way that was wonderful. I'll just tell you one other thing, and I was rereading this morning, and I just had to laugh out loud. One of the fallacies that he mentions is the aggregation fallacy, and he took the example of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, and his point is that the assumption behind that is those three things are each good things, and altogether they must make a fourth good thing, right? He said that's like thinking about lobster is a good thing, chocolate is a good thing, and ketchup is a good thing. But making a casserole of them is not a good thing. And the point that he was making was that if you unpack liberty and equality, they really don't fit together very well. Equality can be taken to an extreme that actually becomes repressive of personal liberty. And you see that being played out right now here in the United States in a place like Virginia, where parents are being kicked out of the classroom and told that they really shouldn't interfere with the education of their children, because it's important to rebalance the way race is taught. That kind of aggregation fallacy that lumps all these good things together without really thinking through whether they do fit together or not was something that he excelled at, getting to the heart of the contradictions in something like that.
Look, I do want to get to Scruton's proposal for the common good, which is to bring back beauty and an understanding of beauty. But because I care so much about this, I think it's worth staying for a few more moments on what you said and what his critique is. Because when I tell people that beauty is intrinsic to a liberal arts education, I sometimes get these puzzled looks. So I think Scruton's diagnosis of the problem helps understand his proposal to bring beauty and an understanding of beauty back. But what you just said about parents in Loudoun County, Virginia, and dare I say other places, being told that it's not their job to educate their children, that it's the state's job. I heard that first expressed in Quebec about 15 years ago, and I was actually kind of shocked. But it's an example of what you said about intellectuals naming themselves as the priestly class. I was in a seminar and they were discussing the integration of immigrants in Canada, and there was a big issue around Islam or other religious minorities moving into Canada, and people had no trouble expressing the view that the role of educational institutions is to shape the common culture according, which then I said, well, but if the parents disagree, don't parents have a right to educate their children? And the answer I got was no, that it's actually the job of the state to shape culture, even if parents disagree. And I thought, wow, well, then why do you guys call yourselves liberals? Because I thought liberals believed in freedom and I thought they believed in subsidiarity. And the real answer was that they're people who call themselves liberals, but they're actually progressives. And progressives believe in using the power of the priestly class of intellectuals and the arm of the state to enforce a particular version of culture that they get to choose. That's what I felt in that meeting in Canada. And when I said that, they're like, oh, you American who believes in the right of families to educate their children, you're naive. That's not the wave of the future, right? So Scruton is really powerfully diagnosing this problem. And so he calls it this deconstructionist theology, which actually says that there's no objective meaning, that there's no legitimacy or objectivity, and then gives the power to the intellectuals. He calls this process a naysaying on the human condition, and it creates, he says, a religion of alienation. It's a world of the devil. And here I'm just going to quote, he says in his essay, The Devil's Hand, in the place where love should be, there is absence. In the place of law, another absence. In place of obligation, friendship, and responsibility and right, only absence. This is key, what he says next. Truth is what power decides, and reality no more than a construct of power. Now, if we don't see that playing out today, I mean, I see that playing out. Do you see that playing out in our culture today?
Sure, it's a form of idolatry, which is another one of his themes. I mean, what you described in Quebec is an idolatry of the state. And progressive theology, if you want to put it that way, does engage in this kind of idolatry of power centralized in the state. You see it in a modified form here in the United States because we still have a constitution and the constitution is still living and it's still applied. But frequently, I mean, another reason that Scruton appeals to me so much, Margarita, is that he understood that there's this kind of, I don't know what the divergence between the way we think about our culture and the way it actually is. I mean, I grew up thinking that, we lived in a federal republic with democratic involvement and checks and balances. And the presumption was the state was a potential enemy and it had to be minimized in terms of what it could do. That has turned completely on its head in the last 60 years. I mean, it's just that we're living in one country that's very different from the construct in my head. It's essentially a knowledge oligarchy that depends on expert advice and is run through an administrative machinery that is only marginally connected to Congress sometimes. So Scruton saw through a lot of that in a way that was very useful in terms of understanding the world that we actually live in rather than the one that we think we're living in.
Could you explain that a little bit more? Because I know when we've met for our regular lunches, you've told me many times that in your lifetime, you feel that the common culture that you grew up with and the government that you grew up with has fundamentally changed. Can you just explain a little bit more what changes? You mentioned going from an idea of a federal republic with a minimal state to having what you call a knowledge oligarchy with an administrative heavy state. What other changes in government and culture and in the church have you seen that has led you to the work of Roger Scruton?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I think I'll answer it this way, and it may not be adequate. Perhaps we can return to it. But there was a local sense, a very intense local sense to life when I was growing up that just doesn't seem to exist anymore. I mean, location has been eliminated by the technologies that we've invented. Geography is an idea in maps, but it's not really alive in your head because, you know, look at what we're doing right now with this Zoom seminar. I mean, the country, I think the country has become so complicated. The machinery of government has grown in order to fit the kind of changes that we've had in population, demography, religious belief. And so it's, so the language, it's very close to, it's very close to the late Republic in Rome, where you have vestigial institutions that to some degree still function, but they're not really where the power centers are. I mean, if you listen to, I mean, the perfect example of this is the kind of vaccine paranoia that's going on in the country. I'm quick to say that I got the vaccine. My family has the vaccine. I support people getting it, but it really is used as a weapon to get people to do what the government wants in a way that I find very odd and really alien to the way that people thought when I was growing up. You know, I mean, fear is a significant factor in the exercise of power in this country in a way that it wasn't 40 or 50 or 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So, all right. So you mentioned a couple of things, right? You mentioned a lack of connection to place, the lack of connection to community. Plenty has been written on that, on the alienation that people feel from their neighbors, from each other. You also mentioned fear. The growth of fear. And I wonder then if we can connect some of these cultural changes. Look, what I'd say I've seen in my lifetime is I've seen, for example, with my students I taught this past summer in Scala's seminar on liberal arts education, I saw students asking questions I don't remember students asking 5 years ago, which was a fundamental question. Does anything unite us as a people? It used to be that there was a sense that our common institutions, although flawed, were legitimate, and that the fundamental American vision of society and democracy, commitment to religious freedom and importance of worship in the sacred, that these things, sure, they had their differences, but that there was a common culture that united us. And my students really question whether or not there is anything that unites us. So how can Scruton, and I think he's so important, I have taught many times his short book on beauty and explaining how his work on beauty relates to answering my students' question about a common culture is what I want to try to get to in what's the remainder of this webinar. So Scruton, one of his major areas of work was on aesthetics and beauty. And why does a topic like beauty have something to do with how we understand these questions around politics and shared identity?
I think that little book, I love the title of it. I think it's a short introduction to beauty. It's really an incredibly rich little book. And look, I'm not a philosopher, but what I drew from that text was Scruton's sense of organic harmony, fertility, right order, and purpose as being kind of central to what makes something beautiful. And he breaks, if I remember correctly, he breaks his discussion of beauty down into human beauty, the beauty of nature, everyday beauty, and artistic beauty, and the particular things that mark each one of those. And then the flight from beauty, which he says is the essential, one of the essential characteristics of modern culture. So harmony really mattered to him. The organic really mattered to him. There was a sense in which beauty encourages us to see that life is good and that it's right to have a place in it for human beings. And all those things just kind of resonate with the human spirit, I think, in a way that's very positive. I don't know that answers your question, but when I read that book, he uses the expression of beauty as a window on the transcendent, and I love that expression. that it reminds us that there is more than, the federal deficit. It reminds us that there's more to life than our checking accounts and renewing Comcast. I mean, there are things that draw us out of ourselves and lift us to see the stars, and not just, kind of grovel in the dirt all day long. It makes us more, beauty makes us more than simply animals, because we recognize that there's more to life and that life is good and we have a rightful place in it. And, so much of politics today just is conflict and infertility. And that's not life. That's not what gives people a reason to not hang themselves. So I would, those are my impressions of that little book. I mean, it was incredibly rich in terms of its content. I really encourage people to read it, by the way, and don't be defeated by the beginning if you're not an academic, because the beginning is a little bit tough, but stick with it. And the text is really excellent. I'm sure you remember this, Margarita. He has that wonderful transition from talking about the beauty of nature to everyday beauty. And he uses the specific example of the garden, taking nature and not treating it rapaciously, but organizing it in a way that has kind of a human content and harmony that is also very pleasing. That's really, he was really beautiful when he wrote that.
Listen, I want to encourage readers to read it. As I mentioned, that's the book of his that I assigned to students, Beauty, A Very Short Introduction. And I assigned it in my summer program on liberal arts education. And let me tell you, a student who picked that to write the summary of it, that was her assignment. She had no background in philosophy, had never studied aesthetics or culture, and she was afraid. She talked to me beforehand, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this. She came back with a phenomenal presentation to the class, and she got me on Zoom and said to me, her name was Ariana. She says, Professor Mooney Suarez, that book has changed my life. I look at everything differently now. Thank you for introducing me to Roger Scruton. So I do tell you, anybody can pick this up regardless of how much background you have. And in fact, I just wrote an essay that grew out of my summer experience called Why Choose Mystery Over Ideology? It just came out in Comment magazine. But what my students resonate with, as I mentioned a moment ago, they have been told for the last 5 years or more that society is nothing but power conflicts and that truth is nothing but power. And when you bring the topic of beauty in, it does what you just said. It reminds us that human beings have a purpose that's transcendent, that's self-gift, that there are things in the world, as Scruton describes, that we are simply meant to enjoy, right? And what I think Scruton does in his book on beauty, and he also says it, if I may say so, drawing on his essays, one of his essays from Confessions of a Heretic, what he says is that so much of beauty, we tend to think of it as, oh, it's just something that pleases us. Oh, it's something that makes me feel good. Oh, it's self-expression. And what he does in his book on beauty, A Very Short Introduction, is what you just said. He says, no, actually, beauty teaches us to be human, and it teaches us that there's order and form and meaning in the world. So when my students said, oh, wow, beauty helps us choose mystery over ideology, what they mean is beauty helps us see that all of reality, including material reality, has a symbolic dimension. Material reality, our lives are a sign that point to something beyond, and that our rationality is open to that meaning. We reach certainty, but we begin the journey again. And this is what has been transformative for my students. It's been hopeful for them that their minds are, yes, meant to understand and analyze reality, but ultimately to be open to the symbolic dimension of reality. And so beauty helps us see that that ultimate reality is not chaos and destruction, but that it's order. And when we perceive that, when we feel that the culture, the actual built culture around us is beautiful, we feel at home in the world. Because he says in his essay, Faking It, that we can wander through the world resentful, angry, full of suspicion, if we just read Foucault and Derrida, I might say. Or we can find harmony, which you just said. we can find harmony through beauty. And the experience of beauty, the experience of harmony tells us that we belong in this world and that our perceptions and our experiences do fit into something orderly.
I think the biggest, I have a story to tell you that exactly illustrates what we're talking about. But before I tell it, I want to say that I think people are frequently unaware of how difficult it is to feel grounded, how difficult it is. I mean, loneliness is something that all of us feel at one point or another, but we live in a lonely world now because we can't connect, and we can't connect because of an excessive understanding of the word I. And Scruton talks about this. The world that we live in is an entire world of I this, I that, and with a loss of the sense of we. And that connection is crucial to giving us a sense that, oh yeah, this is a good place. This is where we belong. The humanizing effect of art and literature. I've been married for 51 years, and I fell in love with my wife on the first date, and I'll tell you why. She gave me a copy of Rilke's poem, Abend, Evening. I really encourage people to read it. I still have it. I framed it, and it utterly, I mean, she was a beautiful woman then, she's a beautiful woman now, but what really got my heart was the idea that she understood that poem. And it's hard to go any further than that, because until you read it, you don't know what it is, but it perfectly captures what we were talking about earlier of being, we're creatures of clay, but we yearn for the stars.
Right.
Yeah, and that's just really powerful.
Yeah. And so look, here's another area where I think, Scruton maybe isn't totally understood or could be considered controversial, that because he cared so much about beauty and he had, I would say, a classical understanding of beauty, that beauty isn't just something that pleases us. It has intrinsic properties of harmony, or to use Aquinas's terms, right? Harmony, purpose, clarity. Because of that, he argued, not exclusively, but he argued that culture can't only be popular culture, but that we need high culture, in a sense, beautiful things that, without having to explain it to somebody, capture one's attention. Now, people always say to me, no, isn't beauty just the blob of paper I made in my, first grade art class? And I say, well, you explained to me why at Princeton University, all the photographers for the quinceañeras, the first communions, and the weddings go to 2 or 3 spots that I can tell you, these beautiful arches, the chapel, and guess what? They absolutely never pose for pictures in front of the ugly school of architecture. I'll just say that. Sorry, I just called it ugly. Just come here on a weekend and look at where people are taking pictures. Now, why is it controversial? And in the Catholic Church, let's get to your experience in the Catholic Church. Why is it controversial, sometimes even in the Catholic Church, to argue that there's such a thing as high culture?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, because the church is infected with modern culture just like every place else. I mean, the church has plenty of people with really lousy taste or bad ideas that are informing their idea of harmony or fertility. I mean, the church is also, the church is not in a dominant cultural position anymore. When it was, it had the ability to attract really keen artists. I mean, intelligent artists, gifted artists, and provide them with topics that they could turn their genius to. That's no longer the case. And if you look at architecture, for example, in Catholic churches, if you go to mass in a church that was built in the 1960s, I mean, good luck. I mean, it's ugly. It just is. Because the theology behind the construction of the church is wrong. The idea is wrong. The part of the dispute over traditione, whatever it is, the Latin Mass document that was just issued by the Holy Father. Part of the problem there is that people in the church right now are hungry for beauty, and the liturgy and the architecture around it, and a lot of in the Catholic experience over the last 50 years has lacked beauty. So you have to go back in the Catholic tradition to find the sources that that would give you kind of a roadmap to beauty. You have to forget the 60s, forget the 60s and the 70s, because they just don't work in a lot of ways. I'm speaking as one who had the experience. Believe me, it's just not fun.
Well, so what you're describing, the fact that the Catholic Church has put together not a small number of ugly buildings in the last 50 years, I think is an expression of why ideas matter, right? Because the Catholic Church, if I understand it correctly, used to emphasize the creation of culture, not as an idea, but as a living reality, art, music, building, because it was understood that human beings perceive themselves as humans and encounter God through excellent works of culture. Now, of course, Catholic theology is also that we're all co-creators with God. We all make certain things. But today, one may not encounter in the Catholic Church this kind of beauty that Scruton is talking about. And so what I am asking is that, as you, someone who's worked inside of the Catholic Church, and you use a lot of Scruton, right? That what does it look like for those of us listening to this to bring forward a vision of beauty that Scruton is talking about, right? And I think he believes that we need to uphold artists, people who know the classical tradition of art, architecture, and literature, and film, which is what you intended to study. And that if we want to create a common culture, well, culture is not an idea. It's made up of works of art that teach us who we are as humans and teach us and help us to encounter God. Would you say that that's correct, what he's saying?
I would. And also people listening to this or watching this webinar, if they have an interest in how the church thinks about art and culture, really one of the best things that I've ever read in that regard was John Paul II's letter to artists. I think he did it about 1999, but it really captures, I think, the Catholic genius for culture and art. So I would suggest reading that. Look, I mean, the Catholic Church exists to encounter God, to lead people to an encounter with God. And when its architecture or its liturgy deflects from that, people get confused. And that's certainly fed part of the outflow of people from the church over the last 25 years. There are a lot of other factors that are part of that, but if you don't find beauty in one place, you're going to go looking for it in another. And to the degree that Catholic worship became pedestrian, people left, as you know, is understandable.
Well, and I think what Scruton was saying, we've already said that he believed that human beings are intrinsically desire meaning and purpose. He also argues that human beings intrinsically desire the sacred, and that we don't only encounter the sacred in a mystical sense, though we definitely do that. We encounter the sacred through our built environment, through the music we create, through the literature we create, through the films. And so he has a wonderful video that I've shared with my students in my class on aesthetics and Christian education. What happens, to get back to where we started about an hour ago, what happens when popular culture, everyday culture, is desacralized? And I think he's warning us that desacralizing culture dehumanizes us. And so both in our sacred art and culture, but also in our popular culture, we have to be able to name something that is a fullness or a presence that is leading us somewhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, I think we're on the same page in this regard. I mean, I made the point about this desire to belong and the desire to have some sense of why I'm here. And certainly in the architecture in church architecture, people go to church in order to have that sense of belonging and purpose affirmed in a sacred encounter with what they can't fully understand, but which they understand is transcendent. And when that's lost, people starve. And popular culture deadens the desire for meaning through a whole list of very interesting anesthetics and distractions and noise, and that dumbs down or depresses the anxiety level and the pain that goes along with the loss of meaning, but it doesn't eliminate it. People still have that that longing, and that accounts for an awfully lot of like psychological problems in the country, and the suicide rate. People need to belong. They need to be rooted, and they'll go where that is provided to them. And you can kill that pain for a while, but you can't make that go away. It's part of being human to search for some sort of meaning in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I often ask, what I said actually at a recent talk that I gave at Hillsdale, right, where I tried to talk about liberal arts education, I said that someone who has a liberal arts education should be able to answer the question, when was the last time you experienced joy? And I don't think that we should leave questions of joy to simply watching an Oprah Winfrey show, which might be okay, right? But part of the concern I have, because I've worked all my career in education, you've worked most of your career in the church, is that education isn't helping people understand what are the intrinsic goods that are going to give them meaning and purpose. And some people say, well, that's not practical. Education needs to be practical. Well, I think experiencing joy and understanding meaning and purpose is eminently practical. And in fact, Scruton says this very powerfully. When you can answer those questions about meaning and purpose and joy, it completely changes the utilitarian calculuses that you make, because it gives you the end to which you're striving. And young people are being told that either there is no end, or any end that they choose is just as good as any other end. And so how does that ever lead to the common good? So I guess, Fran, I want to start taking some questions. I think one question people want to have, and I'll ask someone to write this down in the chat box. Just repeat the name of the poem you mentioned, and somebody please write it in the chat box.
Abend, Abend. It translates as evening, and it's by Rainer Maria Rilke. It's fabulous. It's just absolutely fabulous. And it really touches on some of the same things. It's short, but it touches on some of the same things that we're talking about. I want to add, just before we go to questions, I do want to add one other thought, and it builds on what you just said, Margarita. Joy is not happiness. They're two different experiences. Happiness is kind of a general feeling of satisfaction and contentment and pleasure with the world and life. Joy has an exaltation to it, kind of a lifting up to an exultant state that the experience of the sacred provides. It's transformative. It's not simply, hey, today's a pretty good day, I'm in a good mood. It's some experience of the transcendent, or some experience of some extraordinary encounter with a thing that completely transforms your spirit briefly. But that's joy. And that's what a devout faith and an experience of the transcendent provides. I think I've always felt it was very different from happiness or contentment.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are some, now let's reflect a little bit on your career and how these ideas have shaped the work that you did with Archbishop Chaput, as well as some of your recent writings. We've done a sort of big, wide review here of a lot of ideas from Scruton, going from his critique of the meaninglessness of culture to the power intelligentsia, to talking about his ideas of beauty as having intrinsic harmony and a sense of transcendence and purposefulness, right? What are some practical things? What are some baby steps, perhaps, that people listening, whether they're in education or the church or in families, can do to live these ideas that Scruton talked about?
Well, I'll tell you the one thing that's kept me sane over the last 6 months, because I'm angry most of the time, and you can't live in that space. I just find a way to get to our adoration chapel every day. And typically I go when no one else is there. I try to do that. And, I read a few chapters of scripture and I just pray for 15 minutes. So the whole thing is over in half an hour, but it anchors you in the day in a way that has really worked for me. The other thing that I think helps is just focusing your life on the things in your relationships that work. If you're a good husband and a good father, you really kind of can't go much lower than a B on the rating scale. That's it. You don't have to write the great novel. My life is a happy life, and it's going to be forgotten very quickly when it's done. That's what most of us end up being, is forgotten within 50 years. But that's okay if you're remembered by God. That's the only one who matters. And Scruton was very big on this too, that power, real power, is exercised by individuals in their individual choices and their actions. I exercise real power in the kindness that I show to my family, or the help that I give to a friend. And, the big plans, the 5-year plan, may or may not work, probably won't. It'll probably hurt a lot of people, but I can contribute to the little platoons that Burke talked about, and that meant so much to Scruton. And that's a meaningful life. That anchors me in reality, not in ideas, but in reality relationships. So trying to recover that or keep that alive in my head has been one of the reasons that I probably haven't jumped off a bridge. There are lots of problems in the church.
Well, I mean, what I hear you saying goes back to, perhaps if we're going to put a concept on it, it'd be the concept of little platoons from Burke. What I heard you saying was that when you feel yourself angry, or just as a habit, right, that you go to adoration, you go to silent contemplative prayer. Well, what happens in contemplative prayer? Most of the time, nothing, which is everything, because it's actually opening ourselves to the receptivity of what God wants to do in our life, right? So contemplative prayer is maybe the antithesis of strategy and control. And it's fundamentally about openness and receptivity, right? And what I heard you saying is that sometimes in response to what's going on, we want to have that 5-year plan. But ultimately, the vision of Scruton as a conservative was that, no, it's not a 5-year plan. It's small, freely done acts of love and service, building relationships with people, building families. That's what builds culture. It's a bottom-up view of culture, and that order will arise larger. Would you say that you think, or that Scruton's arguing, that larger forms of the common good and social order will arise from these little platoons, from these families, from these powerful small acts of kindness and service to other people? Because I've also heard you say, on the one hand, we need these little platoons and we need these families. But I've also heard you say that by no means should people of faith or conservatives or anybody who cares about the common good retreat from political life.
No, you should be that's part of our gospel. I mean, you have to be engaged in the culture. That's always been part of the Catholic and Christian tradition. But you also have to be, what I liked about Scruton was he understood the importance of politics, but his goals were always shaped by modesty, restraint, humility, and the knowledge that we can contribute and we need to contribute, but we can't expect dramatic results. I mean, the whole idea of culture ties in with cultivation and growth, and a healthy culture grows out of these little actions that we're talking about, rather than, let's build the hydroelectric dam in 5 months. I mean, culture emerges naturally, like maturity in a person does, and just doing the things that you control are really important. And also, if you do them well, then you don't lose faith. You don't become depressed because you see the fruit. If you give love in a responsible way, you get it back, and that reassures you and helps to keep you going.
Well, I struggle with this as well, Fran, because it seems to me that in my time in education, the need for friendship and love and meaning and purpose and God has just grown. And I often feel that the need far exceeds what I'm able to do. I mean, it's why I started Scala, which I mentioned, is trying to restore meaning and purpose in universities by promoting classical liberal arts education, by being a hub for these conversations on beauty in the human person. But I wake up most days feeling like the task at hand is way beyond what I can do. And what keeps me sane, as you mentioned, is a good dose of humility, that I'm an instrument for God in the world, that it's not about me. And that if I go about my daily work, the work I have in front of me, the classes that I teach, the organization that I run, the network that I'm trying to build, that's going to be my contribution, my my, dare I say, legacy. I mean, a student recently asked me, what's your next research project going to be? And what are you doing? I said, well, I'm at the point in my life where I really care about leaving a legacy. I care about influencing the next generation of leaders in the church and educators, passing on what I believe to be true and good and beautiful. And through education and through these webinars, I get to do that. So what I say to students who feel frustrated or scared about the future, you mentioned fear at the beginning. I do think an antidote to fear is practical, meaningful action in the world. So when I say that these ideas are practical, I think they give people, by giving people a sense of meaning and hope, it helps them fight this nagging feeling that nothing I do matters. And what I hear you saying, what I'm saying is that what you do matters a lot. What you do today matters a lot.
And that was the genius of Scruton, Margarita, is that he had both feet on the ground. I live a lot of my life because of the nature of the business that I was in. I mean, the business, the task that I did for all those years. And also my personal inclination is to be very cerebral, and for a cerebral person to encounter Scruton is really a humiliating experience because I'm never going to be smart enough to absorb everything that he taught. I'm not even remotely in the same class that he was intellectually, and yet that doesn't finally matter. My life is going to contribute something, and particularly if I do it well with my friendships and my family, that's what's going to determine my eternity. I wish I were smarter. I'm not, but that's okay. I can still make a contribution, and that's a pretty healthy way of looking at the world.
Yeah. Well, we're going to move now to some questions from the audience. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A button so we can, continue this conversation. But as I give people a minute to do that, I mean, I will just say that Scruton, I think also in his work, The Face of God and the Soul of the World, he really emphasizes, I mean, it sounds obvious, but perhaps in this moment in time, it's important to reflect on this. He actually really talks about encountering other people face to face.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, this was all, of course, written before masks and mask mandates, but he says that we've almost objectified the human person as a body, and we've stopped looking at people in the face, and that the face communicates an identity, expression, meaning, and it communicates the soul, right? And so when you talk about small groups, and at least for me, for sure, during these times when it's actually been difficult to have face-to-face encounters, we need to sit down with people face-to-face. And is there a sense in which our political life is being troubled by the lack of face-to-face encounters? Do you think, Fran?
Oh, for heaven's sakes, yes. I mean, we don't really want to listen to each other, because it involves engaging with the other person, and it's just easier not to do that. So, I mean, our political system is certainly suffering from a willingness to face-to-face engage the other person, which almost certainly forces you to listen to the other person, which therefore calls into question your arguments, because the other person will have a point of view as well. I think if Scruton were alive right now and seeing where we're at, he did only die like 10 months ago, but he certainly was sensitive to the fact that we've lost this connection with the eyes of the other person. It's the eyes. He makes that point, and it's a really tremendous point. He makes a point about pornography, as you certainly know, that so much of modern pornography eliminates the face, and particularly the eyes, and treats the body as just sort of this enfleshed, this animalistic source of passing satisfaction. But sexual desire is really centered in the eyes of the other person, because the eyes are where the subjectivity of the other person is, and that's what's attractive, and we've lost that, and he's very good at the way that and particularly in The Face of God, he's extraordinary in the way that he highlights that in art and music and everything else.
Well, what I think also that, beauty is inherently related to civil discourse. I work in an institute of higher education. That's where I've spent most of my career. And we live in a time where people want to bring back civil discourse to education. Well, what I said to a writer I met last week, Kathleen Parker, who writes for the Washington Post, I said, I'd love to do a dialogue with you about beauty and civil discourse. And I thought, wow, that was kind of an interesting, intriguing idea. Now, why did I say that? Because I think that the term civil discourse, which I do believe in, what you just said, people need to listen to each other. And very often civil discourse has come to mean the deconstructionist version of truth, finding what's wrong with what somebody else says. And it's almost like instead of listening to the other person, we're looking where to take them down. And I'm not saying I'm against, debates. In fact, I sponsor a debate club here in Princeton. But that the face-to-face encounter with the other person, listening, sharing stories, oftentimes in conservative circles is like sharing stories. That's not part of truth seeking. That's, emotive, right? And you as a storyteller, can you tell us about, do you agree with me that sometimes people who identify as conservatives think storytelling is nothing but emotive and isn't related to civil discourse?
Well, it's not just conservatives. I think anybody who's kind of ideologically driven is suspicious of storytelling, but storytelling is way more persuasive than kind of a political argument, because people are immersed in the experiences and the thoughts of another person when they're reading a good story. That's primordial. People, all the way back to the beginning of our species, we've been storytellers, and people love to listen to the stories of other people. I've learned a lot about life just listening to the crises in other people's lives, or reading a really good book. They're a terrific novel. Those are the things that draw you into another life and make a discussion possible. As you were talking about civil discourse too, it reminded me of two of the principles of why Scruton was so big on biblical religion, because he said that biblical religion provided the two things that have made the West as a civilization so good and so positive and successful. One of them is irony, and the other is forgiveness. Irony tells us that no matter what we think of the other person, we have to look at ourselves with the same critical view, and that gives us a sense of humility. And the other is forgiveness. If I forgive you, then I can be forgiven. And until I'm willing to forgive you, I cannot be forgiven. And those two things are kind of principles of civil discourse that we've lost in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, and I loved what you said about storytelling, because it is fundamental to who we are. And I think oftentimes people, when they hear civil discourse, they think of, let's get to first principles and, let's think about logic. Look, I teach a class on research methods where we talk about first principles and logic. I'm not against that, but I'm saying that we've almost forgotten that storytelling is also a part of civil discourse. And to tell good stories, we also need to build this common culture, because as McIntyre, I think, says very persuasively, our personal stories emerge through conversations, right? And people are, in my experience, young people are eager to have these questions, to have these dialogues about their stories, because they're searching for meaning. And McIntyre says we co-construct our stories through conversation with other people and through knowing tradition. That's what I think McIntyre is kind of bringing together, friendship and tradition. So I think storytelling is extremely important to help people ground their identity. And as you said, I think listening to other people's stories and counting them as humans helps us realize that we need to forgive. We need to see other people as human beings who have faults that need to be forgiven, as do we. So forgiveness is an important part of civil discourse that we have lost. But why?
On the storytelling thing, I had come back to the church when I read The Power and the Glory.
By Graham Greene? Yeah.
Yeah, that was an adult conversion book, a conversion within a conversion book. I read that book 8 times, and I didn't really believe in the reality of sanctity until I read that. And why do I believe in it? Because you have this alcoholic priest who has fathered an illegitimate child, who nonetheless becomes a saint through his actions. And it's deeply connected to the messiness of life and the implausibility of being human on one level, and the it's just real and very powerful. And that was, somebody's story, that changed my life.
Well, Fran, thank you for sharing your story with me, because leading up to this webinar, you sent me some, I believe, unpublished essays that are talks that you've given. But what I took away from the collection of your own talks that you recently gave to a group of bishops, I understand, the remarks you gave at the Napa Institute, where I was in attendance in July, you talk about this need for forgiveness and ongoing conversion as something for you, something that you have had to practice, to take seriously this call to ongoing conversion, to forgiving your enemies, and while being aware of your need for conversion and your need to receive forgiveness, also being courageous and speaking the truth with love, which is why perhaps the Graham Greene story, The Power and the Glory, tells the story of a very sinful priest who, in spite of his sinful actions, is also in some ways proclaiming the truth. And it kind of, through a great story, gets us to realize that you can both be a really great sinner and also have a truth to share.
Yeah.
And what we don't want to conclude is that because we're really bad sinners, we should just retreat from the common good, which I think that is a kind of temptation from the devil, I might say, right?
Oh yeah, yes. Yeah, I mean, that we're all sinners. I mean, and we're not going to escape that. We're going to continue sinning, but growth and sanctity is one step at a time, and never abandoning it, and never abandoning the idea that you can become better. I mean, that's part of just the Christian way, it seems to me.
Well, and I think also what you said in your essay, and in your essay that was your talk at Napa, you said, we need a new Reformation. I mean, you, speaking as someone who worked in archdiocesan structures for 40 or 50 years, you've seen some of the financial corruption, you've seen some of the sex abuse crisis from within, you've seen Catholic institutions not living up to their mission, and you've frankly admitted to some of these things in your talks, but you're still hopeful in the Christian sense.
Yeah, because it gets a lot worse. I mean, this is a difficult time for religious believers, but it's been much worse, and we are trapped in the present. That's logically so, because we have a limited time on earth, and this happens to be ours. But understanding history, and that's another thing Scruton also emphasized: the importance of memory, the importance of history, learning from history. Inoculates us against for making really stupid mistakes. We're at a bad time for the church right now in terms of people who have left. Lots of people have left, but it's also a really terrific time because the people who've remained have remained because they have a heart for it, and courage and zeal for the gospel. And that's the way the church is renewed, is by people like you and me saying, wait a minute, I really do believe this stuff and I want to fight for it. And so this gets back to reasons for optimism and pessimism. I'm a pessimist in terms of the next 25 years, but absolutely hopeful in terms of the long range, because Jesus Christ is alive and real.
Well, listen, we're going to have to wind down, but I want to stay on these points that you just made, because you made them at the Napa Institute, that one, we need a new Reformation. And part of what we're talking about today is a piece of that, because you said at Napa, and I'm quoting the great Fran Maier here, that even non-believers are moved by beauty. Therefore, beauty, that's why the topic of this webinar, idle hands are the devil's work, how to restore meaning and purpose in culture. We need beauty. And we need popular culture that connects people to meaning and purpose. And we need sacred art, sacred music, and beautiful architecture. And Scruton helps us understand why. And he helps us see the consequences of the desacralization of culture, which is to create a culture in my students where they're asking basic questions. Why should I continue with my life? Why is it better to be alive than dead? And is there anything that unites us? Beauty is part of social order, and it's part of the common good. And the church needs to support it, and educational institutions need to support the construction of beautiful things. That's point number one. But I think where to end on optimism, and you've already alluded to this. You said in your talk at Napa, and it really moved me that you said this, that people right now are longing for personal witnesses to this love. And personal witness is what speaks into our culture right now. You've already spoken about some modern day saints and moral exemplars. But could you tell us, so you mentioned John Paul II, who of course is a modern day saint. He's an exemplar of this. His letter to artists, he understood this vision of beauty completely. I would say Pope Benedict also very much understood the importance of beauty. I've taught his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. If you haven't read that book, absolutely, that should be on everybody's list. Pope Benedict understood the importance of culture and beauty to the church and to politics. But who are some other living saints or moral exemplars or great organizations that are providing this personal witness right now?
That's a question. If you want to find a bunch of really effective people who are also deep believers, the humanities department of Villanova University is great. There are a lot of Catholic universities have lost their identity, but even the ones that have typically have Catholic educators, that are real believers and really committed to forming their students in the humanities properly understood. My exemplars are friends and family. I mean, I don't look around and see any political leaders in the United States that make me think that the country is going in the right direction. I can say this now without being asked if I was being overly praising, but I mean, I one of the reasons I stuck with Archbishop Chaput for the 23 years that I worked for him was that he was he was an exemplary leader, and that's because he anchored his life in honesty. I mean, you might not always want to hear what he had to say because it would be blunt sometimes, but he spoke honestly to people, and he was just. And I don't identify sanctity with big people anymore. I look for it in people like yourself or other people that kind of sustain me in the belief that ordinary people can make a real difference in the world. I mean, you're one of the things that's significant in what you're doing is not just beauty, but you also say wisdom. And that also touches on Scruton. Scruton was a guy with a tremendous respect for knowledge, but it was always conditioned by a broader wisdom. It was in the context of wisdom. I mean, and you saw that in his attitude towards science. He believed in science as a tool for ennobling the human mind, but he had a great line about, I find people with a scientistic mindset disagreeable, which is kind of typical Scruton understatement. I mean, scientism, which translates into kind of a materialist view of the world, he felt was very unwise and potentially really dangerous. So I look for people that I admire in terms of just their everyday behavior. Those are the people that I really look to for personal guidance and as examples.
Well, Fran, I'm going to wind down on that point because if I'm an optimist about the long term, it's also because of you, because of you as a friend and what you've done with me, meeting with me so often, sharing with me your wisdom, and because of what you just said, that I have seen the power of acts of love and kindness by ordinary people. I have another piece coming out in Plow magazine in about a week, where I recount a weekend I spent with a bunch of ex-Contras in Nicaragua in 1996. I was working at the time for Oscar Arias. I'd been a former president of Costa Rica, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and I was around powerful people, but these ex-Contras took me to a small town in the middle of nowhere, Nicaragua, called Kilali. And what really moved me was meeting women in that town, women who had lived through horrible civil war and had laid down their weapons because they had actually been combatants and had picked up their plowshares and were tilling the soil and had joy and had faith and had hope for the future, despite having seen horrific, terrible acts of violence. Yeah. And in fact, some, not all, but some of the people who had political power were still perpetuating violence. So what got me is that it's very easy to analyze the historical, socio-political, geopolitical causes of major conflict. And all of that was true. But by going to those small towns, I saw these women who, through their acts of what you talked about, forgiveness and kindness in daily acts of tilling the soil with love and faith and hope, they were changing that place from the bottom up. And it's because of those women, one of them named Carmen, it's because of them that I get up with hope every day, because if they've done it after what they've lived through, who are we in this country that's probably the most prosperous in the history of the world, that has, as you said, at least a lot of constitutional freedoms in the law? Who are we to become nihilists who think that we don't need to fight to preserve our country, that we don't need to be joyful? Who are we to walk around resentful and angry all day long? So I encourage you, Fran, to keep fighting your anger and to take that energy to the Adoration Chapel and turn that time into the next good article that you're going to write for the National Catholic Register, the Catholic Thing, First Things. This is where you can find Fran Maier. I encourage you to follow him and his work at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I will say that our sponsor for today's event, the University of St. Thomas in Houston, is doing something similar to what you talked about at the Villanova Humanities program, trying to line up scholars who understand this vision of culture that we've talked about as building up the sacred, as communicating hope and creating objects of beauty that speak to everybody, because beauty is something we're intrinsically created to know and love and appreciate, and dare I say, share with other people. So this is what I think some of the legacy of Roger Scruton will be. I mean, as someone who died, as you mentioned, less than a year ago, I don't think his legacy has been written, but I wanted to have this conversation with you today to go through his own experience as a young left-leaning intellectual who gets transformed by the 1968 riots that were so destructive in Paris, the student-led so-called revolutionary movement that really attacked tradition and truth and the sacred, and his entire life as, frankly, as an outsider to most intellectual circles, trying to point out the consequences, the very real practical consequences of the decline of the humanities, of the loss of the sacred and culture, but ultimately how this vision of order that grows from beauty, from a respect for tradition, from encountering the face of the other, small acts of love and kindness that reflect that we're created in the image and likeness of God, fallen in sin, but capable through God's grace of actions that uplift. And I think Roger Scruton's legacy needs to be shared. That's why I just had to do this webinar. And it's why this webinar is part of a book on education for beauty and wisdom, where we bring together thinkers, culture creators, and educators who can think practically how to take these big ideas and reshape culture and bring this culture into church institutions through sacred art and music and architecture, which is being, now these discussions are happening, and they're going to be happening at Scala's spring conference, April 30th, 2022, which is precisely on these themes. I'll also make a plug, if I may, for Scala's soon to be launched Substack, which will be authored by Bill Gaunch, who works with Scala, and it's going to be called Risking Beauty. How do you find, why should we choose mystery over ideology? And this is going to be our attempt at Scala to put out for everybody these ideas about beauty, art, and culture, and see them at work in this world. So my goal in this talk was to have a conversation with you and understand why you're a pessimist, what that means, and ultimately why to be an optimist. So any final words of optimistic hope for our listeners today, Fran?
Well, if you read the scriptures, you can't possibly be hopeless. I mean, it's just the epistles in particular really speak to me. I mean, Paul, think about the situation that Paul was in and look at where we are now. I mean, he was constantly harassed and rejected, and yet he changed the world. And people can contribute to that change for the better simply by trying to conform their lives to the word of God. That does really mean something for me. And by the way, I really appreciated this conversation. Margarita, you're a wonderful interviewer, and I hope I lived up to your expectations. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was wonderful. Let me just end by saying, from one Catholic to another, go to scripture, right? Go to letters of St. Paul, go to the Psalms. The Psalms have been speaking to my heart. And I think right now, as one of my evangelical friends said to me, the scripture speaks directly to the human heart. Oftentimes as a Catholic, I start talking about like doctrine or the catechism or something like that, but there is tremendous wisdom right in the scriptures. And you talk about, Romans 12, I think of, Isaiah, I think of people, Israel, I think of the Psalms. So we have lots of reasons to be hopeful. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank
My
you to
pleasure.
the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Thank you to all the donors to Scala, of which some of you listeners I know are, and hopefully more will. If you want to see these webinars continue, please consider supporting Scala, and please try to come to our conference in Princeton on education, beauty, and culture, April 30th, 2022. Thank you, Fran. Good luck to you. Talk to you soon.
God bless you. Thanks so much.
Bye now.